So our first speaker is going to be James Choung, who's the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship USA. He's been in campus ministry for 26 years and previously served as InterVarsity's National Director of Evangelism. He also is the author of a book titled Real Life, A Christianity Worth Living Out, and his latest book, Longing for Revival, unpacks what revival looks like, how Christians can anticipate it, and how they can experience it in their own lives and in larger movements. He provides a model of revival leadership for Christians who want to facilitate and spread revival in their context with implications for evangelism, mission, and growth. So please welcome James Choung.
Hello, hello, hello. It's good to be back. And I guess if we're running with this metaphor, then, if Ed was the main meal, I guess here we go. I'm trying to get it right. And Pastor Henderson then was the dessert. Then Pastor T was the after-dinner coffee. Is that what he said? And then that made Ben the nightcap, I think is what he said. Well, then, I guess, what does that make me? I guess, does that make me the dream? Yeah? Right? You know what I'm saying? Or the nightmare, right? So, where are we with that? But it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me out. I do want to start out. I'm Korean American, so by nationality American, but I am of Korean descent. And hey, what's up, Koreans? You're in the house. As a Korean Protestant, a lot of us can point back to this particular event that really is the birthplace of the Korean Protestant church for many of us. But almost every Korean Protestant church would have its place here. And so I'm going to take you back to January 1907. Up until this point, there have been places where there have been groups of pastors and church leaders. They've been sort of meeting throughout the country, and they've been gathering in small groups and starting to confess their sins to each other, confess their dryness and where they were, and it became places where these pockets of renewal and revival were coming up from the ground. And so as that was happening, people were starting to hear that this was happening all in different parts of the country, out in Wonsan and in other places. And so this is all starting to culminate. And by January 1907, they're in what is now the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang. And there they are at a Presbyterian church, and 1,500 folks have gathered to pray and to learn more about what it means to walk in the faith. Now, the first night goes, and the leaders are feeling like it's not happening. It's feeling spiritually, for lack of a better word, constipated. And so it's not moving, so they take the next day, they're praying it through, they're trying to pray for breakthrough, and then that evening, something wild occurs. And what happens is a Korean national leader, a Christian, goes up on stage and confesses in front of the whole community that he's held hatred against the Western missionary, right? And so in Korean culture, that's unheard of, to have an elder confess like that so vulnerably and so shamefully is how it feels in the culture. But he actually gets on his knees and asks for forgiveness to the Western missionary. Now, the Western missionary had no idea, right, that he had offended this person at all. But what that breaks loose is a night of confession, a night where people started sharing the things that were going on in their lives. And this was what is considered now the Korean revivals, or the Pyongyang revivals. And from there, a lot exploded. From the Pyongyang revivals, they sent a missionary 50 miles north to a small village called Yeongmi. And there in Yeongmi was a shaman of a tree spirit. And she was the leader of the village. She had an associate shrine leader. The two of them would lead the worship in this shrine, at this tree shrine for the village. But she lost her first two children to an early death. And she blamed the tree spirit for not protecting her children. And so in her anger, and I just love it, because I just imagine like the Korean kimchi temper just rising up in her, she cuts down the tree of the village where the shrine was, the tree shrine, cuts it down, and as the story goes, actually defecates it, so much so that the associate shrine leader goes like, it smells too bad, I don't want to have anything to do with it, and leaves. And so in my mind, I picture her, this shaman, just sitting near the tree, bereaved, in a hard place, wondering what life is going to be about next. And it's at this point that this missionary from Pyongyang goes up to her and starts a conversation. And through this conversation, this shaman learns about Jesus and the good news that he's come to bring, that he died and rose again so that she could be in relationship with God. And she gives her life to Jesus. And because she does that, she's the leader of this village. She plants the first church in Yeongmi, and the village, basically most of the village becomes Christian. That shaman was my great-great-grandmother. My great-granddad was an elder in that church. My grandparents met in that church. My father was baptized in that church as an infant. And then they went down, and as Korean history unfolded, then they had to run and went south and ended up in Busan at the south coast of Korea. And there my grandfather was part of a team that planted a church that still exists today. 4 years later, they go up to Seoul, same team, they plant another church there, still exists today. My dad then becomes an immigrant to America, studies in Arkansas, of all places for college, then comes back around and helps a fledgling church plant in Seattle, where I grow up. And then I'm sent over to Boston, where I go to school, and then me and my staff worker at the time, we planted a church in Boston 25 years ago. That's still there, it exists today. And there's a way that there's this ripple that has happened since Pyongyang. And we're just one of those micro ripples, but a ripple that's extended over generations and generations. That's something like that. Revivals start in these hidden ways and then have these incredible implications that history cannot fully put down. But I am a child of revival. I'm a fifth generation descendant of the Pyongyang revivals. And many of you here are children of revival. That when you look back, for those of you who found your faith in the Jesus movement, you're children of revival. And maybe there are people who are affected by that movement that then ended up discipling people that ended up helping you get to know Jesus or discipling you in faith. And many of us are children of revival. So much so that you almost would argue that really the movement of the church throughout history over the last 2 millennia sort of ebbs and flows on the waves of revival. And it's not a straight line, it's not a perfect 10% year over year kind of annual growth kind of thing, but it is this thing where revivals in history seem to have a tide that comes in, and then sometimes the tide goes back out. But seems that Christian history seems to grow on the backs of revival. So much so that Mark Shaw, in his book Global Awakenings, has this quote, that global revivals are at the heart of the global resurgence of Christianity. He's referring to the 20th century as we're seeing around the world, this global resurgence. And we just got to think that that's happened before. Likely these are the ways that God will happen again, that God will move again. That many of us who are sitting here are children of revival. Well, it's not just history. Praying for revival is also a biblical prayer. In Psalm 85, the sons of Korah have their prayer. It's a prayer, and in verse 6, it says, "Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you?" And that there is a prayer in the scriptures, and this desire for God to renew, to revitalize, to come and revive people who were dead, so they can come to life again. Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? And that is a prayer I've been praying. There's a prayer that many of us have been praying, that the Lord would revive us again. So in this talk, I do want to talk about, then how do we anticipate that? How do we prepare for that? Are there things that we can do, and what can't we do when it comes to revival? And so I want to do that, but to start that off, I want to start off with the definition of revival. And there's lots of different kinds of ways to talk about revival. Are they mass movements? Are they experiences of the heart? And we were trying to find a way to talk about it in a way that would help kind of bring it together, in a way that would help us, particularly in a varsity where we serve, but perhaps also for others, so that revival can not just be something like is on the fringes of Christianity, but something that could be embraced by more of us. Revival for the rest of us, in a way. So revival, we define it this way, that it's a season of breakthroughs in word, deed, and power that ushers in a new normal of kingdom experience and fruitfulness. And each line means something really important to us, that a season of breakthroughs. We didn't want it to just be an event. You know, I grew up in a Korean immigrant church where everything was called revival. You know, Koreans out there, you know what I'm talking about. Anything that wasn't happening on a Sunday was considered revival. So if it was a Saturday night gathering, that was a revival. Anytime we went on a retreat, that was a revival meeting. Anything was revival, right? And you could see why, because of our history. But we wanted to get away from just labeling an event revival, and instead wanted to talk about a season of breakthroughs. It's a place where you're seeing God move in multiple ways in a particular season. And in that way, it sort of brings it up. So in that way, Acts chapter 2 by itself, we wouldn't necessarily consider revival on its own, which is crazy. But then as you look at the rest of Acts, as it unfolds, right, as Acts 3 and 4 and 5, and you're seeing the church grow and the discipline hitting, as Ed shared this morning, there's a way that then that becomes a season of breakthroughs, and the book of Acts gives you a sense of revival. And so it avoids then trying to pick a particular event or a particular time. Even with the Pyongyang revivals, there were things that came up before it and then things that happened after it that gave it a season of breakthrough. And then that season of breakthrough is characterized in word, deed, and power. We're getting this out of Romans 15, where Paul seemed to say that a gospel that is fully proclaimed comes in word and in deed and in power. And the word being the word rightly preached, the gospel from the scriptures rightly spoken. Deed, acts of compassion and justice, and power, a sense of God's supernatural ministry, the Holy Spirit moving in ways that we just can't explain by rational means. And somehow, instead of denigrating each other, maybe word, deed, and power can come together in love so that we can see the fullness of the gospel proclaimed. See, and why this became really important to us, particularly at university, because the joke about us, we're a campus ministry. The joke about us is that we're wordy, nerdy, and a little bit dirty, right? And we're the nerds. We're absolutely the nerds. And our word circle is huge. We love scripture study. We want to dig into the Bible like crazy. Our deed circle is decent, as we had integrated Bible studies in the 40s. And there's things that we've done to address racial justice and injustice in our movement. Power circle for us is a lot smaller. So if you can imagine, big word circle, medium-sized deed circle, tiny power circle. And we felt like instead of just swinging the pendulum to one thing or another, what would it mean if word, deed, and power were equal-sized and overlapping? And in that way, they were coming together to help. Because you know what, right? If you're in the word circle, if you're primarily like a word person, it's pretty easy to look down on the deed folks, right? Like, they just care about things. They only care about stuff that's down here. But how come they don't care about people's souls and helping people come to faith? And if you're a word person and you look at the power people, right? They're just a whole bunch of, they're laughing in their seats. They're just rolling in the aisles, these holy rollers, right? You look at them and there's ways that they can get denigrated. Right? Or if you're a deed person and you look at the word person and you're going like, they seem so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good, right? Or the deed person looks at the power person and goes like, oh, you guys, you're just praying in the closets all the time. How come you're not out in the streets with us? And then there's the power people, right? Who look at the word people and they can go like, oh, you have a form of godliness, but you deny its power, right? And the power people look at the deed people and like, you guys seem so angry. Why don't you come over with the intimacy of Jesus? And there's ways that at each person, if you center in one circle, it's so easy in the church to go like, we don't need the other circles. But what we've seen as we've studied revivals, it seems that although revival often starts with one of these circles, that as a revival matures, it heads toward the middle. And you see these things coming together, word, deed, and power. So it's a season of breakthroughs in word, deed, and power that ushers in a new normal. And this is the sense of, there's a new expectancy in the room. There's a new hope that happens. If you're in a community where there aren't a lot of people coming to faith in your community, that's a baseline. But then imagine that all of a sudden, there are people starting to come to faith, and that starts to become a regular thing, maybe 2 or 3 people every month. If you go back to 0, that's going to start to feel a little disappointing, right? But it creates a new normal. And then from that point, you might have hope for the next thing. And that's what we want to talk about when it comes to revival. For anyone who's been through it, even on a smaller scale, it ruins you. It has a way of getting into you. You have a set of expectancy. You have a baseline of what you think God can do. And you want more of that, right? It's a new normal. And when you have a season of breakthrough, a new normal breaks through. Of kingdom experience and fruitfulness is the last line. And this is where I want to lean on a little bit more in this talk, is that there's revival, there's the debate. Is it just external? Is it just internal? And we wanted to put it together so that revival was both an experience within someone as well as an experience and a fruitfulness that we see outside. And why that's important, right, is that there has been, and this is going to sound so obvious, there has been no revival in history without revived people. Right? No revival in history. There's been no revival in history without revived people. So there is a place for revival to happen in the heart. British evangelist Gypsy Smith would say, hey, when asked, how do you want to start revival, right? This is the old story. He said, go into the closet, close the door, draw a chalk circle around yourself, and ask the Lord to start revival within that circle. That's how it starts. And I'm not trying to tell like an American hero story. I'm not saying it has to be one kind of person that the Lord has put it on. But sometimes God then takes pockets of people that he's reviving and then gets them together. And they start having a season of breakthroughs in word, deed, and power. They start to have a higher expectancy of what God can do. And that stuff starts to grow. And so we wanted to have a wider definition of revival that would be helpful. Maybe to make this point, with the next slide, I live in Southern California. I live in LA. Oh, and we know earthquakes. For those of us in Southern California, we know earthquakes. And we had a pretty big one that we felt within the last month. Now, I didn't know this before moving to Southern California, but earthquakes, they come in all shapes and sizes, right? There's a whole bunch. There's the ones that drop. It's just like a boom. They're the ones that sort of roll for like 5 seconds or so. There's ones that shake, right? They have different things. There's a diversity of earthquakes, for those of you who didn't know. And I remember the first time I was in an earthquake, this might be too much information. I was going to the restroom in a Panera Bread, and all of a sudden, the whole world just went like this. And I thought I was getting vertigo until I heard the screams outside. And I went, oh, all of us are going through that. That's an earthquake. So that happens. And then also the strength varies. And we have something called the Richter scale, which is an exponential scale that lets you know the strength of an earthquake. And a 1.0 on the Richter scale won't wake you up from your sleep, but a 10.0 could level some cities, right? That's so you got a whole diversity. I think that's also true with revival, right? That you could have a personal revival, and we'll just call that's a level 1, if you hit the next slide. And that's the one that happens in the heart. But that's so important. You hear about a John Wesley whose heart was strangely warmed. You hear about the 2 elderly women who just felt called by God to pray for their island, and which sparked off the Hebrides revivals off the coast of Scotland. Right? There are places where there are people who are revived. That's a personal revival, and they're important because they are the seeds from which revival can grow. But then from a personal, it can move to communal. Right, a level 2. And that's when they're starting to draw around other people, where Wesley gathered a group of 30 folks, and they got gathered, and I think they said about 2 or 3 in the morning, they felt God's Spirit fall on them. And that kept on expanding what was happening with John Wesley and the Methodists. Level 3, right, and you can see goes to regional, and then it goes to national, and potentially to global. But what we're trying to say is all of this is revival. And I think that's helpful, right? Instead of getting around fights over definitions or, is that a revival? I don't know if that's a revival. We just say, that's a revival that was happening in your heart. Or that was a revival that was happening in a small group. That's okay. Because all revivals have started small, right? Even Acts 2, where there were the 3,000 who came to faith that day, right? They started small. There was a place when Jesus was just gathering his disciples. There was just 12 of them at some point, right? You just trace a revival back far enough. All revival started small. So don't denigrate. Don't look down at the small beginnings, right? Don't despise the day of small beginnings. They start small, and they always have to start small. And so we go, okay, God, what are you going to do with that? And be open to what he's going to do. So it's with that anticipation that I just think when we start to think about revival, and it's been a long journey for me to embrace this word revival. If you've heard me preach before, like decades ago, you'll find it deeply ironic that I am championing for us to long for revival these days. But I do think it's important. And I think the key here then, for us personally, to kind of be open to revival, I think we have to do this. And this is a quote from Danny Silk. We kill our expectations and we raise expectancy. We kill our expectations and we raise expectancy. See, expectations means God has to show up a particular way. And if he doesn't show up this way, I'm disappointed, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm despairing. Right? We kill that. We don't get to dictate to God how revival will come. And instead, we raise our expectancy. We place our trust in the character of who God is. We place our trust in a loving God who is making all things new. And we say, God, have your way. You do it your way. And our hope rises. Expectation says, oh, God, you didn't come through before. I need you to come a certain way for you to be good again. Expectancy says, I'm wide open to your will. It's very different. And I think if you're like me, right, I've been in professional Christian ministry for 26 years. It's easy for me to have expectations. It's easy for me to be about what I want to see happen. It's easy for me to get cynical, right? Like, oh, we've been through this again. I don't want to be cynical anymore. I want to be so open-hearted to what God wants to do in the world today. I want to be so open so that he might use me however he wants to use me. I don't want it to be about my empire or my dreams or the things that I want to do. I want to be so open that God could use me however he wants. I want to kill expectations in my life so that there could be expectancy. Because if I've got hope, you got to think the one who has the most hope probably has the most influence. Another way to put this, if we want to get theological about it, is we got to crucify our expectations. Let them die on the cross so that on the other side, expectancy, your hope, can be resurrected. And if we try to strategize our way into revival, if we try to manufacture it, if we try to say like, Lord, well, it's going to come through this 3-point plan, right? We're savvy enough to try that. You could just think God's going to kill our expectations. He's going to kill those expectations whether we want to or not, right? We got to kill those expectations, kill them, and raise expectancy. And I think that's what helps us anticipate them. It gives God room to move. So with that, as we anticipate, as we kill our expectations, as we raise expectancy, how do we do that? And in what ways do we need to prepare then for potentially revival? And I'm not one here to tell you like every person, every generation has someone like revival's coming in this generation. I'm not that person, right? I'm actually of the person like, isn't the kingdom come where we're all headed when God makes everything right? Aren't we headed to one unending revival? And if that's so, then my seeking and longing for revival is just merely being in the will of God, right? I don't know the time. I don't know the day. I love generational theory. I could try to make predictions, but I'm killing those expectations. And I say, God, you just do what you want to do. Right? Hey, we just need to, this has been a prayer for me that's been so helpful for me. Like, it's hardly a day that's gone by in the last 2 years when I haven't said this. Right? Whenever I'm walking into a staff meeting I don't want to be at, Lord, kill my expectations. Raise expectancy. Like if I'm at a place where I don't know what's going to happen, if I'm going into a hard conversation with a colleague, if I'm trying to kind of deal with something in my family, Lord, kill my expectations, raise expectancy. Who knows? I might have said it when I was coming up those steps. I did. Lord, kill my expectations, raise expectancy, because I don't know how you're going to use this talk, Lord. And what if we entered every space with that kind of anticipation? What if we allowed the kingdom to sort of go forward? I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know the plans. I prepped as much as I could, but I'm going to kill my expectations now in prayer and raise expectancy for what you might do. Would that change our conversations, our meetings, our gatherings? Could that possibly put us in a place to be the most open-hearted people in the room, to see then what God might do? And so with that then, in our day, we do live in a post-Christian world, and some would argue a post-secular world, right? And those are fascinating if we had time to unpack those things. But we do live in a time when both the progressive secular agenda and Christian nationalism have used up the runway and the airplanes have not taken off. They have not delivered on the hopes that they promised, right? It's a tough time. And so it's in that kind of cultural milieu. How should we Christians then prepare ourselves for revival? And I want to present you something. And this didn't make the book. I really wish we had this before the book came out because it would have made it. But I want to make a distinction between relevant and remnant. And like I said, we're pretty nerdy in InterVarsity. So this is what we do when we're trying to figure out attention. We create 2x2 grids in our movement. There's lots of 2x2 grids. So here, there's high relevance and low relevant. And relevant, I'm just trying to say, like, this is like our ways of connecting with people, with the culture, or with people who don't yet follow Jesus. And remnant would be like our spirituality, our rootedness, our resilience, our ability to just stay with the faith in the midst of the storm. So if we're low remnant and low relevant, right, I would consider that kind of community a seeking community. They haven't quite figured out their mission, so they're low relevant, and they haven't really figured out how they're going to live their life in Jesus either. So it's like a seeking community trying to figure things out. But if you're high relevant but low remnant, I want to call that connected. So these are like you have lots of friends. Your community has lots of people who are not Christian connecting with your community, right? There's lots of places, and you've got Zumba classes, and you've got other kinds of barbecues and other things that draw people in the community in, and they're connecting. So you have a lot of relationships with people who don't yet follow Jesus, but sort of the inner life of the community, that's not very deep. There isn't a deep abiding, right? If you're high remnant and low relevant, we'll call that the committed. Right? These are the holy huddles in some ways. These are the folks that they might not have a lot of relationships with people outside of the community, but they're serious. Right? These are the folks who they're praying, they're studying the scripture. These folks will weather the storm. And then high remnant, always with these 2x2 grids, this upper right-hand corner is like the best spot to be influencing. I'm just going to say this is where, from a deep well of faith, you are influencing the culture around you. Okay. Now, here's the point I want to make. I think 20 years ago or so, maybe in the last generation, the way that we sought to be influential as a church is by going through the connected side, right? So if we were seeking, we would want to push our people out to get connected to people who aren't Christian, right? Like, there's places where, like, be a witness wherever you are. So if you're going to the gym or going to the grocery store or in your coworker, just get connected to people who don't follow Jesus. And the assumption was if you got connected, then you would influence. So we sort of would swing the arrow upward and out. I think what we're finding, particularly in college ministry, this was true. When I was in college, 30 years ago. Oh my goodness. Okay, that's a realization. When I was in college, if you had friends who weren't yet followers of Jesus, you were kind of cool. Like, oh my goodness, right? And we really did a lot to just try to push people out. Move into the dorm where people who don't follow Jesus are. Move out into your fraternity in your sorority house so that you can be a witness there. We really focused on pushing people out, right? And trying to make everything as relevant as possible so more and more people can get to know Jesus through this community. But we are finding today with young people that when we send people out, they may not come back. Right? Like, in some sense, yes, we send them out to evangelize the culture, but the culture is evangelizing us. Do you know what I mean? Back then, like, let's take sexuality for an instance. Back then, like, they might not have agreed with us, but at least there was respect. You know how many heard, you're sort of explaining what you're doing, and they're like, you don't do what before you're married? What? Oh, that's crazy. No, I couldn't do that, but I respect you for it, right? Like that kind of vibe that would happen like 30 years ago. Now, our views on sexuality, we're considered intolerant, bigoted. We're exclusive, right? And you can see then the moral scales have shifted. And now the culture is evangelizing us. Do you hear that? And so instead, if we just push people out to connect like we used to, they may not come back. So instead, if you can click the slide, I think we have to go through the committed route in this day and age. We need people, as Pastor Henderson reminded us, to abide on the vine. We need people to go deeper, to get more connected, to really get to that place where they are in their faith, that root is going deep, so that when they're sent out and the culture starts evangelizing them, they could stand their ground and be faithful. But if we go up the other way just through connected, I just think we'll lose a lot of folks as we keep going on. And so with that, sort of the preparation, I want to call us to this. The next slide shows, these are 4 things that we have when it comes to preparing for revival and experiencing ourselves. We call people to consecrate. Like what will you give up and allow God to make holy in your life? What revival calling do you have? How do you contend for that calling? And then paying attention to your character as you seek revival. And I just want to lean into that contending thing right now. Is that I think we need to contend in the Spirit for revival. Prayer has always been a part of revival. Prayer has always been there. And my parents, as children of revival, I think the Korean church has received a revival spirituality. Small groups, one voice prayer, daily prayers. Those are things that came out of Pyongyang that continue in the Korean church today. My parents go to church almost every single day. I think there's a day or two they don't. In a given week, they're going almost every single day to pray. When I was a pastor in Korea, we had 5,000 people showing up every single day to pray. Right? There are places where if you've been through revival and you know these prayer rhythms, you pray. And sure, in Korea, that was only 25% of the church. But wouldn't we all be glad if 25% of the church showed up to pray every single day? I think we have forgotten what it means to contend in the Spirit. Right? We come together around strategies and resources and all the things that are there. And I just got to think, in the Western world, perhaps are we less effective not because we lack resources, but because we have too many? And that maybe the Lord is actually calling us to contend on our knees and to learn how to pray again so that the community of faith learns to depend on God. Why? Because He's got to kill the expectations of the church so that expectancy can rise up again. We need to contend again. And I tell you, I don't have my parents' spirit of prayer, but I'm trying to learn it. And I'm so late in the game. And InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, as we long for revival, I haven't seen us pray as much as we have in the 26 years that I've been with us. I just think we need to keep contending and learning. If we've got a revival calling that has been on our hearts for a while, I think we need to learn what it means to contend in the Western church again, to pray together. My friends in Ethiopia, they're just seeing crazy fruit. Up until the civil war that's been happening, and that's been traumatic for them. But they are a movement of 60,000 strong. At the time, so this is a movement that eclipses the American version, InterVarsity, with a tenth of our staff. So they have 100 full-time staff serving 60,000 students. Okay, and it's a movement. They're on every single campus in their country. And we went to Ethiopia to visit them, to learn, like, what strategies are you using? I mean, you're getting such better ratios than we are on campus. Can we learn from you? So we went out to learn from the Ethiopian movement, and we went out to check them out. And what we found was, when it came to strategy, they were basically doing what we do. There wasn't anything new under the sun with strategy. It was almost boring, to be frank, the strategy. But what did they do? They contended. They prayed. Imagine, it's a 6-day conference. One whole day was dedicated to fasting and praying. And it wasn't like, oh, everyone go to your own stations. Here, you could do the art station over there, and you can do the incense there. It wasn't like that. All gathered under a tent, all 700 of them, all praying out loud for 6 to 7 hours. And I got to think that releases something, right? That aligns them more. And I just came back floored. I'm like, oh my goodness. What would it look like for us at national conferences to go like, you know what, when we get together, let's just take a whole day to fast and pray? Would we show up? Oh, I'm going to downtown Wheaton, right? Like, can you imagine? That's not going to be a big draw in American conferences. And we had to wrestle with that in InterVarsity. Are we willing to take a whole day? We did it the last time we gathered. A whole day. And it energized us to fast and pray together. We need to contend for the things that God has put in our hearts so that our wills can be aligned with his will. And how can we as a church prepare our communities, gather the coals so that we're contending together so that we kill our expectations and raise expectancy? In my last kind of minute, I want to share some first fruits right out of the gates of what's happening on campus. As we're coming back to campus, we're finding our conferences are starting to overflow. Like, it's been the first time in a long time for us to be together. And we were really hit by the pandemic, but there's a lot of spiritual hunger on campus. But I want to share a story, and this comes out of Pennsylvania. The region, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Upper Peninsula, Michigan, that represents our rivers and rails region, and they've been seeking revival. So they've been devoting themselves to prayer, which is crazy for us, right? Remember, nerdy, wordy, a little bit nerdy? They're seeking to pray. And this just comes out of initial outreach, right? Itinerant staff meets student during a prayer walk at a community college where he has struggled to connect with students despite his faithful engagement. But this time he meets, and I'll call him a Rob, and senses God inviting him to linger with the student. He shares about losing his grandmother. Rob shares about losing his grandmother who raised him. Staff sits with Rob as he grieves and shares the revealed evangelism card about he will wipe away every tear. It's a way we can start spiritual conversations on campus. They discuss heaven. Someone interrupts them and gives Rob a free Diet Coke from a vending machine malfunction. Staff takes the moment to share about the importance of accepting free gifts, right? Then he shares the gospel, usually the big story. They walk on the campus together discussing the spiritual resistance Rob is experiencing. They come to a straight and narrow sidewalk at the entrance to the college. Staff shares about the straight and narrow path and how this might be the place for Rob to decide what he wants. They come to a crossroads in the sidewalk. Staff asks Rob if he's ready to take the straight path. Rob says, what I've been doing isn't working. So then staff shares the gospel again, and Rob decides he wants to give his life to Jesus. They prayed together, and staff is working on continued follow-up with Rob now. First fruits. And we just had to lay down our expectation and seek God by contending in prayer so that he might raise expectancy in us. And I would hope that you would join us in InterVarsity as we long for revival together. Can the church long for revival? Let me pray. Father, we ask for a season of breakthroughs in word, deed, and power that ushers in a new normal of kingdom experience and fruitfulness. And all God's people said,